of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening to you. It's 8:01 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. With us in Wednesday's Cross Question, isn't it? I'm getting my days mixed up. Justine Greening is here, former Conservative Education Secretary. She's the founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. Baroness Jenny Jones, Green Party peer, former Deputy Mayor of London. Rabbi Dr Jonathan Romain, the Minister of Maidenhead Synagogue in Berkshire. He's the author of the book The Naked Rabbi and chair of the Assisted Dying campaign group Dignity in Dying. And Tim Stanley is here, a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp your message on that number as well. You can text 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And we'd love you to watch us on Global Player. And you may notice I've got headphones on because my earpiece gave up the ghost in the last hour. So all the others have got earpieces, so they look far more professional. Although it seems as though some listeners think that they're being fed lines from their spads or whatever because they've got an earpiece. Doesn't work like that. They have to have the earpiece to hear the questions from you, the callers. So let's crack on with the show.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, our first caller is Les in Birmingham. Hello, Les.
Hello there. So I'd like to ask the panel, do they think that these pro-Palestinian protests, at their core, are they a sincere wish for peace or are they ideologically driven?
Tim Stanley.
I'm not going to try and psychoanalyze every single person on a protest. I think that's very unfair. There will be a hard core of people who, yes, are ideologically motivated and probably don't just want peace in Gaza, but probably don't want Israel to exist. That hardcore does exist, of course. But when the marches began, I made a point of attending one of them, not going on it, attending it. And the vast majority. Is there a difference? But there's a big difference. I was there as a journalist, not as someone to join in. But there was a vast majority of people were there because they just felt that what was happening in Gaza was atrocious, and they were against it and wanted to protest it. And yes, a large number of those people were British Muslims, but it doesn't surprise me that British Muslims feel a particular kinship with Gazans and wish to come out onto the streets and protest and demonstrate in their support. That doesn't surprise me. Now, I at the same time, I do recognise that the fact that the marches have been going on week after week begins to feel, particularly for Jewish Londoners, as though the city has been occupied by people putting one particular point of view who, partly because of strength of numbers, get to dominate the debate and get to dominate the message. Though there have been counter-protests in favour of Israel and in support of those people who've been taken hostage. So I would argue that at this stage, particularly when British state policy is changing, and the government has belatedly come around, I think, rightly to the view that it should support a ceasefire, although there are questions to be asked about, so what does that look like in terms of arms sales to Israel, etc. Given that state policy is changing, given that many Jewish Londoners do feel very uncomfortable about the marches, I would be inclined to urge people to scale them down or to stop or to take up other forms of protest. But even though I am sympathetic towards Israel, even though I am a small c conservative, I found it uncomfortable how some on my side of the argument have tended to assume the bad faith of those people who are coming out demonstrating, when I think it's quite reasonable for people to want their voices to be heard in what is, after all, an appalling humanitarian situation.
There you are, Jenny Jones, the reasonable voice of the right.
Well, I was trying to think of some other way to say I agree with that Telegraph journalist. I can't, so thanks, Tim. I think I haven't been on any of the marches. I haven't attended them simply because I don't have time. But I think that most people are just, at their wits' end about what's happening in Gaza. And we constantly hear stories about what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is doing to innocent people, and it is incredibly disturbing. And I think people can't help but be stirred up by that. So I have spoken to Jewish friends, and The ones I've spoken to have said that it's complete nonsense, that they're frightened to go into town, and they understand, and some of them have even joined the protests. So clearly there's a huge variety of views about this, and at last, perhaps we are seeing a point at which enough countries come together and might actually stop.
Is there any point in further marches, though, when Britain has now supported a UN motion for a ceasefire? I mean, that was what the marches were essentially calling for. Well, Britain's now supported that, so job done.
Well, I think there's more to marches than just actually achieving stuff. There is the feeling of unity, being in a crowd of people who feel the same way. Most people in Britain feel powerless. We've had a government for 14 years that is decomposing, almost deliquescent, and people are in despair about deliquescent. It means melting.
That's a new word. I like that word.
Oh, good. I'll spell it for you later. And so I think they feel powerless, and so this is just a way of making themselves heard.
Jonathan.
Well, I certainly agree that there are mixed motives of people who are going, and some are genuinely appalled at what's going on. Others are anti-Israel from the start, and they're just using the excuse. But I certainly defend the right of people to protest. What strikes me as strange is the intensity. I mean, we didn't do it for the Uyghurs. We don't do it for the Tibetans. We don't do it for the Ukrainians. Why is this particularly so incessant? And I suppose one of the problems is that we've got two simultaneous conflicting truths. On the one hand, that Israel has the right to try and get the hostages released and try and put an end to Hamas, which has vowed to do October the 7th all over again. On the other hand, the way they're pursuing those goals has involved an enormous civilian problems, and they're both true, unfortunately. I think what's key to remember is the date. I mean, today is the March 26th. In Israel, it isn't. In Israel, it's October the 8th. In other words, they're still in the day after that. And, you just need to ask ordinary Israelis. They are still traumatised that their country's been invaded, that, 1,200 civilian citizens were killed and 400 hostages are taken away. They are still emotionally traumatised. And that may be part of the context of why what we think over here and they think over there may be different perceptions.
Justine.
I think it's been interesting to see how the diplomacy's changed through this. I think that has been in part a response to what's been happening in Gaza, fundamentally. The limited progress getting the hostages back, and then the humanitarian crisis that is, I think, absolutely shocking, frankly. And I think what the protesters have done, I think, yes, maybe there's been some element of it that, of course, is more ideologically driven, but it seems to me, and I haven't been personally involved, although I have been in London on days they've been happening, that broadly it's been many, many people who've just been extremely concerned about what they've seen and wanted to find a way to express that. And I think that is part of how we ourselves as a country work our way through what our stance is on this. And I think in the end, the only thing that's really going to probably stop the protests is a longer term settlement on both sides that can somehow navigate us through this. But I personally think we're as far away now from that broadly as we probably were in October, unfortunately, arguably further, because what you now have is a Gaza Strip that is largely devastated and possibly going to become more devastated. So almost there's not only the human toll that this has had, there's also a very physical challenge to now overcome about where those people will live and how they will live. And I spent obviously a long time as Development Secretary. I was involved in the Syria response. I've been to many refugee camps in my time, and I think often, arguably the physical reconstruction is easier than it is for people to mentally get over what they've experienced on both sides. But actually these people are in the same place, and it ultimately will need to find a way to somehow live side by side in peace.
That's the worst aspect. It's not just that it's a terrible present. The future is dire too. And the real irony or tragedy is that actually on October the 6th, things were looking good. there'd obviously been the peace with Egypt and Jordan a few years back. There were the Abrahamic Accords with Bahrain and UAE. There was serious talk about progress with Saudi Arabia.
But that's partly why it happened, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because Hamas and Iran decided that would be the worst of all worlds for Saudi Arabia and Israel to have some sort of normalisation of relationships.
Exactly right, but it's important to remember they were actually heading in the right direction. And this has put this back, not just for a few weeks, for 30 years, I would have thought.
30 years?
Yeah, a whole generation of hate is being growing up on both sides. I mean, Israelis, how will they ever trust someone from Gaza or even the West Bank again? Gazans are going to feel pretty bad about Israel. What's interesting, though, is actually the Arab states' reaction. And actually, they haven't really done very much. I mean, Egypt's refused to let any in. The other states haven't cut off relations with Israel. There's been no uprising in the West Bank. Actually, it seems that fellow Arabs think that Hamas has made a dreadful mistake and has really done their own people a massive disservice.
Many years ago, I was an archaeologist and I worked a lot in the Middle East, and what I saw everywhere was that Palestinians were badly treated. That was true in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt. So the Arab world has never been particularly sympathetic.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I really don't know. I remember visiting the West Bank and seeing young people with absolutely nothing to do, youths standing on corners, children playing, no school, and so on. Now, I'm not sure if that was all the time or just when I went, but
well,
clearly...
there is a reason. I mean, they destabilised other populations. If you remember, King Hussein chucked them out of Jordan because they were taking over Jordan. The same happened in Lebanon. They became a destabilising force in these other countries. They were, rightly or wrongly, greatly resented by fellow Muslims.
I was interested by what you said, Justine, about the change in diplomacy. And I think you're absolutely right. But what do you put that down to?
I think in many respects this has been one of those humanitarian crises that has developed that we have seen on our TVs every single night. And also, rather than it being some quite remote conflict, there's something about this one that is absolutely understandable for people. And I think the impact, particularly on children, is shocking. And, wherever you have sympathies, and I think for most people, actually, they can see all parties involved in this. I think people are very even-handed. I just think the impact it's had on such a young population is shocking. And if you look at parts of the world where there's been long-term civil war or unrest, and then you look at the social development of those children, often I think Guatemala's one example where when you look at those children when they get into their 20s, the rates of domestic violence, in societies are much higher because these are children who've just simply grown up being surrounded by violence. So I think we have to be conscious of the fact that this is some long-term challenges that we've sown the seeds for now. And I've been to that refugee camp. I think the one in Jordan that was set up, I think it was 1948, and it's still there now. And I think we need to be so careful that we don't consign people to that sort of a hopeless future. It's a lack of hope.
And I think we tend to have a view of refugee camps as just a series of tents, and they're not. I mean, if you go to Ramallah, I mean, there's like fully fledged buildings there. It's not. I mean, they're not particularly luxurious. It has to be said, but there are different kinds of refugee camp. Tim, can you be in any way optimistic about the future for Palestine, for Israel?
No, I can't. It's not my place to be, and I wouldn't know how to begin. But I would like to pick up on the point about the shifting diplomacy. I think that Britain's position was initially framed, of course, by the horrors of October the 7th. There was just a feeling that one had to rally around Israel, and it had a right and an obligation to restore its security and get its people back. That changed because of shifting circumstance. But there was also that rallying around on both left and right because Britain is, as an establishment, pro-Israel. It just is. And in being so, it is actually out of touch with public opinion on this. And as I say that again, as someone on the right who is broadly sympathetic towards Israel, I've just become very conscious in the last few weeks that the centre-right keeps saying, as if it's a Brexit or a culture war type issue, the people would be on the side of Israel. No, the public is overwhelmingly on the side of a ceasefire and sympathetic towards the Palestinian position. And I think that leaders in both parties, but particularly Labour, have actually found themselves out of step with the grassroots. Labour might have thought it could triangulate a bit on this, that it could create some distance with itself from Corbyn. It could take a position that would be in stark contrast to what came before, and by so doing win a lot of moderate voters over. I don't think that's going to be the case, because actually this has probably turned out to be the one issue where the Labour grassroots and the bulk of Labour MPs have actually been still Corbynite in instinct, rather than taking Starmer's position. So I think he's actually been out of touch with them on that. And a final point, people keep laughing at things like Queers for Palestine, because it sounds like chickens voting for foxes. But you have to understand, for a lot of younger people who have no sensitivity to how vile Hamas is, and perhaps no sensitivity to the realities of religious belief either, they see Israel-Gaza as a civil rights issue. And so they bracket the rights of Palestinians along with the rights of gays, lesbians and trans people and black people the world over. From a young person's perspective, this has all been a giant civil rights struggle like Martin Luther King Jr. I think that's where I think they're wrong, and where my sympathy shifts much towards Israel, because I think, no, these are religious fruitcakes and they would wipe out all Jews if they could. But that's why you see things like Queers for Palestine, and why you see young people apparently siding with something they don't really understand, because they see it very different from the way the older establishment does. It's a civil rights issue for them, whereas the older establishment just sees it in pure, crude
Why have we got
terms.
Ukraine fatigue, which is just as appalling in many ways, and where the suffering has been terrible, and yet everyone seems to have forgotten about it, and it's impossible to get hosts anymore, and Ukrainians feel very forgotten. Why is it that this issue is so particularly
Because the media now ignores Ukraine. And I'd like to think this programme is an honourable exception, but we could do more. But when do you hear a discussion on Ukraine anywhere in the media nowadays? You just don't. So
There's also residual anti-Semitism, let's be honest. So the last week we've been discussing China's influence on British government. Well, I don't see thousands of people out there campaigning against this. It's not something the far left particularly worries about, but it's actual, provable, quantifiable interference in our politics by a foreign government.
we have a question on
By
this.
contrast, Israel, there is an assumption, people are obsessed with the idea that Israel dominates global politics, calls all the shots, tells Western governments what to do, when there's zero proof for it. And Israel has very often found itself isolated by governments, and is being isolated right now.
It's being isolated, I would say, predominantly of its own volition, because yet again, Israel did adopt the moral high ground, had the moral high ground, and I'm afraid has frittered it all away. Because of the actions of its Prime Minister.
Well, Netanyahu.
On Ukraine, I would argue that perhaps we haven't been talking so much about it because, in a way, it seems a much simpler conflict that we are on the side of Ukraine. But
we're not demonstrating, are we? We're not out in the streets. We're not surrounding the Russian embassy. Why not?
No, but with Israel and Gaza, there's the conflict, within ourselves, within our society, whereas there isn't the conflict about Ukraine.
I see what you mean. Well, look, we're going to move on to other subjects in just a moment. It's 19 minutes past 8.
LBC
22 minutes past 8, we have Justine Greening, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Green Party peer Baroness Jenny Jones, Rabbi Dr Jonathan Romain and Tim Stanley from the Telegraph with us answering your questions. Had a really good discussion about Israel and Gaza. Now, I'm going to be very interested to see where this next one goes. Adam is in Luton. What do you want to know, Adam?
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to ask the panel and yourself, actually. So given that the world's invested in the pharma companies creating a vaccine, are we not all shareholders? I mean, recently we've just heard today that the vaccine will be for sale, finally. However, it's £100. So is it gone from protect everyone to now protect the rich? I mean, there were times we were praying for times like these to be able to buy the vaccine. And now I feel like it's unaffordable for a lot of people. So I just wanted to ask your panel if they think that's right, given that we invested in it for the betterment of the world, and we in the United Kingdom actually went above and beyond to invent the vaccine and give it away for free, and then now it's come to us again. It's so high of a price. I just wanted to know what you thought, and if you think it's fair that we, the shareholders, get nothing, it would seem.
Well, let's give the background to this. Boots is going to begin selling doses of the Pfizer vaccine to those ineligible to receive it from the NHS at £99 per dose. That does seem incredibly high, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Since 2021, only those at high clinical risk are eligible to get a COVID booster jab, people like me. By contrast, the flu jab is generally around £15 to £20 per dose. Meanwhile, Pfizer's rival Moderna has also announced plans to sell its COVID jab through private pharmacies. Jenny, let's start with you.
Well, I agree with Adam. It just seems outrageous, really, doesn't it? I don't know if this is the same vaccine that we developed, though, because we're now into different forms, aren't we? Different strains of COVID. So perhaps they have gone a little bit farther. I confess I'm old enough to have the free vaccine, and I'm very glad for it. I haven't had COVID yet, and I don't want to get it. And it does seem to be a different strain now. I know people who've had it and who've been very ill for a very long time. So I'm just wondering about the rest of the panel and if they've had it and if they're prepared to pay £100 or £99 for a jab.
But you have had the vaccine?
Everyone I could,
right.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And haven't had COVID yet. I'll obviously go down with it tomorrow now. But,
well, I escaped it for 3 years, but I had it last June, and I didn't have the sort of coldy one. I was just literally flat out for 3 weeks, couldn't do anything, and I lost 1.5 stone, and I'd quite like to have it again. Jonathan Romain.
Well, I've also not had COVID, so I'm one of the lucky ones. I certainly know a lot of people in my congregation in Maidenhead who have had it recently, but none have had it seriously. So part of me wonders, well, it's not essential anymore, and I haven't really heard, I could be wrong, of people in large numbers dying of COVID, and therefore it's no longer an essential drug. The other thing I wonder is whether the companies actually need to recoup some of the finances, because there must have been an enormous outlay at the beginning, and I don't know whether they are recompensed by the government, or this is their chance to get back some of the enormous research and qualitative setups they had to do at very high speed.
Would you pay £99?
I wouldn't, because everyone who's had COVID recently has said to me it's like heavy flu. And, okay, I can live with that.
Because, anecdotally, you don't hear of many people having it nowadays, do you? I mean, clearly it's still there and probably always will be around, but it certainly hasn't returned in the way that I think some people were predicting it would.
There was a spate of cases near where I live about a month ago, but none since, yeah.
Justine?
I think £100 is a lot, yeah. I literally can see very few people buying it as a result, but I do think from a public health perspective, you should align it with flu and have a similar approach. But if you are going to sell a vaccine because you think it should be on sale to the public for people to take care of themselves, then I think it does need to be more affordable. And, I haven't looked at Pfizer and Moderna's financials, but as far as I understood it, actually they did exceptionally well from selling huge numbers of vaccines. As we all know, there weren't enough to go around for quite a long time. So I think I would question the price, actually. And I think it underlines probably the need to have a bit more of a thoughtful strategy, because you cannot have a situation where people maybe need to have the vaccine for work. They might not be eligible for vaccine, but if their employer is not willing to pay, yet they have a very public-facing job. There's all sorts of reasons why people may need to stay fit and healthy and reduce their risk. And I think £100 is actually way too much, frankly, to charge someone for having to manage a risk that, in a sense, is beyond their control.
Tim?
I think I agree with that, yes. It came back again last year, and I think it affected people of a certain age, like me, quite badly, because I was sort of knocked up for a few days. It was definitely a strain which affected certain people of a certain age.
You're not of a certain age.
No, I don't mean as in. I'm actually trying to be politer to the people on the panel who are older than me. I'm just not trying to.
How dare you?
That's
I'm
everybody.
trying to draw attention to the fact that I was so very young that I got it so badly. But I have to say that my reaction to the vaccines was probably, apart from that last bout of COVID, and I think I've had it several times, my reaction to the vaccines was worse than COVID itself.
Oh, really?
And I think I would probably not have the vaccine if the government went out and said everyone ought to do it again. I did it. I took everything you were supposed to take because I work abroad. I do foreign journalism, and so I had to take it because the government forced me to. But I probably wouldn't take it if it's a matter of choice, no. I think enough is enough. I think 3 jabs for any disease that's going around.
It is interesting, isn't it, how the vaccine did affect different people. I have a friend of mine who's like a hulking, huge guy, was literally knocked out for 3 days by it each time he had it.
Yes.
And yet, sort of, I got all sorts of things wrong with me and didn't affect me at all.
I was pretty ill for a couple of days after the vaccine both times, yeah.
Would that put you off having it again?
Yes, if I didn't really... I think the price would put me off. To be perfectly honest, I think it's just too much. I think it's a huge amount to ask someone to pay. I mean, I don't know. I mean, presumably they administer it, but yeah, as Tim's just reminded me, I didn't enjoy having the vaccine either. I don't particularly enjoy needles. I was okay about that, but yeah, the vaccine slightly knocked me out. I was very ill when I had... relatively ill when I had COVID. I was a bit like you two.
It seems so long ago, doesn't it? That sort of, I mean, when I think we had to postpone the opening of this studio because of COVID. It was actually the week of COVID hit. We were supposed to open the studio, and then I think the first broadcast I did for it was about 8 months later. And I was talking to someone the other day about. They said, "Oh, so what did you do about your programme doing?" I said, "I did 140 shows from my bedroom, and I really enjoyed every one of them. But it was great to be back in the studio with people."
Of course,
anyway,
it's a mixed reaction. I mean, for many of us maybe here, it was a bit of a hiccup, and we think, it went. But of course, there are a lot of people. It was devastating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, there are a lot of people no longer around because of it, and people listening to this programme who lost relatives. So it was a terrible time. But we survived, thankfully.
Yeah. Right, we have lots more to get through in the next half an hour. If you'd like to ask a question to our panel, and thanks, Adam, for that question, because it was very different from the kind of questions that we normally get. So we like a few different ones to mix it up. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31. News headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
One person's in a critical condition after a cargo ship struck a major bridge in the US city of Baltimore, sending it crashing into the river below. 6 people thought to be construction workers on the bridge are unaccounted for. The wife of Julian Assange has told LBC she believes he could be killed in the US, whatever assurances America provides. Stella Assange says High Court judges have helped America's case by delaying a decision on his extradition appeal. And Rishi Sunak's been forced to carry out a mini reshuffle after 2 ministers resigned. Leo Doherty is to replace James Heappey at the Ministry of Defence, while Luke Hall goes to Education after Robert Halfon's departure. LBC weather: rain moving north tonight, turning to sleet in Scotland and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC.
8:35 on LBC. Justine Greening, Baroness Jenny Jones, Rabbi Dr Jonathan Romain and Tim Stanley with us taking your calls. Well, here's a text question actually from Jamie in York. Does the panel think Rishi Sunak should pick a fight with China? It's interesting that you put that question round that way rather than saying, should China be picking a fight with the UK? Justine?
When it matters, yeah, absolutely. I think it's unacceptable that we've had this sort of interference in our electoral process that apparently we have, that we've had our MPs effectively harassed and their families in some cases. And I think that's a huge issue that we shouldn't shy away from. I think at the same time, you also have to be practical about the fact that there are economic links between the two countries that kind of will run alongside the political debate. And therefore, you almost have to distinguish between almost these tactical relations that will go on and are the reality of an interconnected world versus the more strategic relations of our diplomatic links and the debates and in this case, some of the arguments that we need to have with the Chinese. And I think that the key for me is just being absolutely clear-sighted about the nature of that relationship.
But the government which you were a member of wasn't, was it? I mean, it was almost sort of cozying up to the Chinese in a fairly blatant way.
There's no doubt that David Cameron as Prime Minister and George Osborne saw improving economic links with China as a key plank of how Britain could improve its economy. And I think looked at other countries actually like Germany that had significantly more exports and questioned whether we could not have a piece of that pie. But I think in a sense the challenge with that is if you're going to improve your economic links, you just have to be very conscious of the fact that the relationship can only go so far, and this sense that you can have that this. Do
you think in retrospect though they were too sort of eager?
I don't know. I actually think it was above all focused on economic links. I think where it didn't go right was in relation to higher education, and I actually genuinely feel aggrieved for the higher education sector. They were told to go out and build links, cultural links, across China, to open themselves up to Chinese students, and literally a few years later they're now told this is absolutely the wrong thing to do, they shouldn't be doing it and they should retrench back. And I think on economic ties, I think in a sense everyone was an adult, but I think there were policy decisions in relation to higher education I don't think you can push on 1 year and then next pull back on.
Tim?
Richard Drax, on that point about universities, Richard Drax MP made an interesting point during the minister's statement yesterday where he claims that when the MOD tries to hire people to work on AI from British universities, they have a terrible time because all the people being produced by British universities who are experts in AI are Chinese citizens. So this is the cost of the globalization of our education system. This isn't a question of picking a fight with China. We were discussing earlier how we treat different countries in different ways. Well, China is a communist dictatorship which has carried out genocide against people within its borders and which seeks to destroy the democracy of Taiwan. It is a real threat. It's a current threat. And the government shouldn't just be in the business of waiting for a moment when it could possibly have an argument. It should institutionally, structurally, systematically be opposed to what the Chinese government stands for and be acting to try to change change the way that it operates in the world and preferably reform its government as well. And so some people may have picked up on the story about the Chinese government hacking the emails of a few Tory MPs. Well, what does that matter? What are you going to find? Some photos from the Imperial War Museum? I don't know. A couple of laundry lists.
I think there might be more than that.
It might be more than that. But the key thing isn't the hacking of their MP, email addresses. It's that those MPs have links to dissidents who have families in China. So if the Chinese are able to get to them, they could possibly get to dissidents back home. That's what matters. I'm not so concerned about Britain's position in the world and Britain needs to be a trailblazer and all of that. I'm concerned about this question of how do we deal with the fact that China is both increasingly the world's leading economic political power and also a communist dictatorship. That's a reality that has to be faced. It's not a question of picking a fight. It's something we have to confront and deal with.
What I find interesting, and I had this with a few people on Twitter yesterday, saying that they were more likely to believe the Chinese government than their own Deputy Prime Minister, who just stood up in the House of Commons and made a statement on Chinese, illegal activities in this country. I mean, I was really quite worried by that and thinking, well, why on earth it's Oliver Dowden, he's got a track record. I said, well, show me the evidence that he's ever lied in the House of Commons, which of course they weren't able to do. But this whole idea that you're going to automatically believe a foreign power over your own government, I think is deeply worrying.
Yeah, astonishing, really. And I think actually we should name what's really going on, which is that China is invading Britain. Not physically, but structurally, intellectually. And that's what it's all about. And maybe previous governments have been a bit naive about the level of infiltration that the Chinese government wanted to have. And certainly for me, if it's a choice between doing without this high level of Chinese investment and being economically perhaps worse off, but being free of external infiltration to really key aspects of our everyday life, then I would prefer to have the freedom at the economic cost.
Jenny?
I think it would be hard to go backwards now. That's the really big problem. If we could go backwards, though, to the question about should Rishi Sunak pick a fight with China. I don't know Rishi Sunak. I've never met him. I don't want to be horrible about him, but I wouldn't back him in any fight, quite honestly. I wouldn't back him in a fight against my neighbour's cat.
Are you being smallest here?
No, I think he's ineffectual. Which is, no, I wasn't thinking about his stature, actually, but thank you for bringing that up. I think he is absolutely useless as a Prime Minister. He just does not understand what the British people think at all, and he talks all the time, and so do his ministers. The British people want us to do that, they don't want a general election. It's all complete nonsense. If we're going to pick a fight with China, we should send David Cameron. But having said all that...
Well, the very man who wanted to cosy up to China.
Well... it was quite interesting when he came into the House of Lords for the first time as Lord Cameron of whatever it is. It really felt as if an adult had walked into the room. He was so confident and he does seem to have changed and has become much more direct.
He's lost weight and gone grey, but I don't really see what there is in his manner that's particularly changed.
Well, you must come and watch.
I do.
Tim.
I'm a sketch writer. I do. I watch him, and frankly, I find him preposterous. He was interviewed by the Foreign Committee a few weeks ago, and he did the classic Cameron thing of, for the first 10 minutes, sounding like he knew everything.
Yes.
He sounded so good. And then he was asked specific questions, such as, what is, in the British government's eye, the legal status of Gaza? He didn't know the question. He was asked how many British citizen hostages are currently held by Israel. Didn't know the question. As someone pointed out, not only do the Americans know it, but they can name them.
I think
he's completely
all the ministers, I don't think any of the ministers has control of their brief. I don't think any of them is competent. And they do lie. We are told lies all the time. And I've said this in the House of Lords, and somebody tried to shut me up and said, you can't call people liars. And actually... we can.
But they're our liars.
We can.
But they're British liars. And he may be wrong on 99% of issues, but when one is up against a foreign power like China, if he's morally in the right, surely you'd back Rishi Sunak.
I don't think it comes down to anything that simple. Quite honestly, as Jonathan was just saying, Rishi Sunak doesn't represent anything for me that's good. No. No, sorry. I'd moved on very quickly.
No, but what I did say, and which you've avoided, is that China is the person who's initiated, and it's a matter of do we respond or do we ignore it?
No.
Surely it's right to respond.
Yes. Yes, I haven't said not respond. It's just how and who and what.
Fiona says, Iain, David Cameron is not elected or an MP. We have an incompetent that we haven't voted for. Well, he was an MP. He was actually Prime Minister, and I think that confers status on him anyway. I rather disagree with... I hear what you say, Tim, about the evidence in front of the committee, but I think he's transformed British foreign policy. I think he's been a fantastic Foreign Secretary.
He has been braver, I think.
And well respected internationally as well.
Who would you rather have? Him?
Oh,
any of his predecessors, going back quite a long way?
Look, he can't even be interrogated by MPs. It is preposterous. I know that constitutionally it's permissible, but this is not the 19th century. There have been ridiculous discussions about calling him to the bar, as if he might stand at the far end of the House of Commons and shout his answers back at MPs. We can't operate like this anymore. In the situations we've got, Ukraine, Israel, you need a foreign secretary who can actually explain himself to MPs, not send Andrew Mitchell along to be his monkey.
Well, he does in front of the Select Committee.
When have you ever heard the Prime Minister answer a question? When?
But he's
Never.
interrogated by the Leader of the Opposition.
It doesn't
He can't
matter.
be
He
interrogated by David Lammy.
He did it brilliantly this afternoon in the liaison committee for 2 hours.
Really?
In fact, he answered the question so well that there wasn't a single newsline that came out of the committee.
Goodness me. I'm not sure I believe you.
It's because all the journalists in the room fell asleep.
They
That
did.
was the problem.
Andrew Marr, I think, was going to lead his programme on the liaison committee, but there was nothing that came out of it, so he didn't. It was that boring. So, which is a kind of a talent to be boring, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, obviously, none of you have that talent.
No.
I wish I did. Not.
Not.
Anyway, it's 8:46.
This is LBC.
8:49 is the time. Justine Greening, Jenny Jones, Jonathan Romain and Tim Stanley answering your questions here. Text one now from Stuart in Liverpool. If Jonathan Gullis is the answer, what is the question? Now, Tory MP Jonathan Gullis has been appointed as he's what Tim Stanley would call a real Conservative.
Proper Tory.
Has been appointed as a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party this evening. He's tweeted that he is ready to take the fight to Sir Keir's hopeless and hapless Labour Party. By sticking to the plan, we'll grow the economy, stop the boats and level up across the country, he says. Well, that's original, isn't it? Is he the party's new Lee Anderson, Tim?
Well, that's obviously literally the spot he's filling, isn't it? I suppose because Anderson's job was previously chairman or deputy chairman of the party.
Yeah.
Deputy chairman of the party. To be honest, this is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic about 100 years after the Titanic has sunk. Right, it's not even
112.
Right, okay. It's not even just as it's going towards the iceberg. The party is completely over. And I'm just impressed at this stage that they can find anyone who hasn't done the role, who hasn't been sacked or resigned from it in disgrace by this point. Any discussion of internal Tory politics is just farcical. And I always, when thinking about the Tories' latest psychodrama, I always come back to there's that wonderful line in the thick of it, full of great lines, in which an MP says, if she admits to something wrong, she'll go from someone who people are angry with to someone who they're laughing at. And this is the problem with the Conservative Party. Some time ago, they switched from someone who people are angry at to someone who they're just laughing at this stage.
The worst thing you can get.
I don't know who else you could put up in that position who might do any better. Lawrence Fox. I don't know.
I presume that was a joke.
Basil Brash. I don't know. We're at that stage where not only does nothing surprise me, but crucially, it doesn't matter. No one's paying any attention, and it won't move the dial.
Justine.
Well,
In fact, can you all three of you be quite brief on this? Because I do want to get another question, and it's an important one.
So I was thinking of Jonathan Gullis shouting out "bad joke, bad joke, bad joke" at PMQs. And if he's the answer to what's the question, then maybe the question is what's a bad joke, and it's Lee Anderson Mark II possibly. I don't dislike Jonathan on a personal level, but I don't think a strategy of the Conservative Party continuing to be reform light is going to do anything other than take it towards defeat at the next election. So I think all of these chances to put people in roles ultimately tell you what the strategy is of Rishi Sunak, and I think it seems to be reform light, and I think that's a mistake.
Jonathan was on this programme a few months ago with Jackie Smith, and I thought they would be going at it hammer and tong. They were charming the pants off each other, basically. It was sort of rather odd to watch. Jonathan?
It makes me feel rather sorry for Rishi Sunak, because actually I think he's a reasonably decent politician, and in a different time he would have made a better Prime Minister. But I think he's got these two massive albatrosses round his neck of Boris Johnson and all the scandals surrounding him and the Liz Truss. And I think whoever succeeded those two would never succeed.
Jenny?
I can hear a sort of scraping noise at the bottom of the barrel. Essentially, they have just run out of any talent, any honesty, really. Yeah, time to go. General election.
But isn't the lesson here that whoever runs the Conservative Party next actually does need to know how to deliver whatever we call it, levelling up, breaking down barriers, equality of opportunity, social mobility, and ideally should have some lived experience.
Some will accuse you of being woke with all that list.
Maybe, but it's coming to Britain because it's what people vote for. So I think the party, whoever's running it next, needs to really understand that issue, why it's important, and to have some personal experience that means they have a chance of actually working out a policy agenda to deliver some change.
I think anyone who runs the party next needs to understand that some of these policies are deeply, deeply unpopular, and they just haven't worked.
Hang on, brakes on here. I would remind you that Gullis was elected in 2019 as part of a landslide headed by Boris Johnson off the back of Brexit, which was distinctly anti-woke and was very right-wing and populist and was very popular. The problem, as has been mentioned, is the Tories have been hit by Ukraine, by COVID, but also by the ineptitude of Liz Truss and also by Boris Johnson.
Corruption.
It is not that right-wing or populist politics are unpopular.
On levelling up, and it was powerful, important rhetoric that actually I came up with in the Department for Education to talk about social mobility. But the big mistake was there was no plan. And what people are voting for now in Britain is a government that will deliver on a plan, and they will switch until they find that government. And it's a message for Labour too at the next election. If they don't deliver on it, maybe they'll have a short existence too.
Here's a WhatsApp question from Terry in Gravesend. Although I believe I know the response from one of your panellists, what is the consensus of your panel on assisted dying? Should there be a parliamentary vote on it? I'm supportive of the campaign for it to be legalised. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has vowed this month that MPs would get a vote on assisted dying being legalised before the end of his first term as Prime Minister. If Labour wins the election, it would be a free vote, which I would have thought it would be whoever held a vote on it. Now, bearing in mind that we have less than 5 minutes to go, I'm going to have to ask you all to be relatively concise on this. Jenny Jones.
Oh, I support assisted dying completely. Why haven't we got that question about what would you buy if you had £500,000 from a...
Because that's the last question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Jonathan, I know your views on this because we've talked about it.
Well, it's not just my views, it's the views actually of millions of people up and down the country, because every single poll shows that 80% or sometimes 75% of people want it, or rather, they want to have the option so that if they are terminally ill, mentally competent and wish it of their own free will, then they can have the... And life is horrible, and death is looming, and they're in great distress and great suffering. They want to have that option. Palliative care may be another one, staying at home is another one, but it's a matter of giving people options. We choose everything else in life, where we live, who we marry, what career we have. Why can't we choose how we die? It's not a matter of shortening life, it's a matter of shortening death and the death throes.
Tim?
I'm very sympathetic to those who wish to legalise it, because I have seen people die and I understand how difficult it can be. I would personally vote against it because of the reasons which are typically raised, such as people feeling pressured by economic circumstance to do that, people not wanting to be a burden on their family, people sometimes being almost compelled by their family to take that option as well. And also because of thin end of the wedgeism, that if you look at other countries, it began as it's just under very specific circumstances of people who are terminally ill, and it has broadened out to include younger people and people who are in mental distress. But most of all, on a point of principle, I think that in this society, the NHS and the state should not be in the business of killing people. We got rid of the death penalty for that reason.
They don't. It's assisted, and only in the sense that a doctor would give the person a prescription and they themselves take it. That's absolutely crucial.
At present, in the NHS, the doctors are there to help sustain and keep people alive. With this legislation, they would now be involved in the taking of life. And as a principle, I think that is wrong.
But they do that anyway.
They do indeed.
I mean, what was the Liverpool Care Pathway all about? What is the prescribing of morphine? We know that professionals in the NHS help people along their way at the moment, don't we?
That is very different from what is being described and proposed, which is a conscious, open policy of helping people to end their life. It's just different, and I can't. And partly because of all the risks I've laid out, I cannot support.
Justine?
I think there's a question of the morality around it, and I remember when we had the debate in Parliament, and I went in that day having had 50% of my constituents right, really wholeheartedly on one side, and another 50% right on the other side, and they were both absolutely heart-wrenching letters and emails from people, and I remember thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do here. But I do know that I would absolutely need to be persuaded that this legislation is sound to vote for it. And I remember all of us went in, I think there were a lot of people who were genuinely open-minded because of how difficult this is, in a sense that at some stage you have to find a route through. At that time, I remember that bill that was put before us was simply not fit for purpose, and it wouldn't have protected some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I remember seeing campaigners afterwards saying, it's as much about the practicalities of how you get this right to protect people as anything else. And so whilst I think you can have the debate on whether it's right or wrong, and there's no doubt that there is a Rubicon here and we have to be exceptionally careful, I think there's a second issue to work through, and maybe we've made more progress since, about just the practicalities of how you protect incredibly vulnerable people at an incredibly difficult time.
So which side did you land on?
I couldn't support it because I really wasn't convinced we were protecting vulnerable people.
The interesting question is, why did they draw up legislation which didn't do that? And I would argue it's because it's almost impossible to do that.
Well, other countries have done it.
Yeah, and the result has been that the numbers have expanded, and it's become more and more...
Well, of course they've expanded, because they've expanded from zero.
Yep, they've expanded to cover other conditions and people in other states, including things like mental distress.
Untrue, actually. The Parliamentary Select Committee only 2 weeks ago said there has not been any instances of slippery slope. People may have started from a different position, but in Oregon, for instance, it's been the same for 25 years.
Well, I would love to continue this, but we're already over time, and we have to get our fun question in, which is from Eddie in Wrexham. The door which Kate Winslet floats on at the end of Titanic has been sold for more than £500,000. Which movie prop would you spend that kind of money on if you had it to spare? Jonathan?
I wouldn't. I would urge the person who paid the $500,000 for that to give it to the RNLI, because a lot of people don't realise it's not government funded. It's funded by the public and voluntary donations.
Jenny?
Well, I would probably give it to charity as well. But if I had to, I would buy the Terminator, the number 2 version from Terminator 2.
So you want to buy Arnie?
Yeah. No, I've met him. I'm a big fan.
Right.
Yeah, I've met him.
You always surprise me every time you come on this programme with something that you say, and I wasn't expecting that. Justine?
Well, the thing that instantly sprang to mind was that beautiful sycamore gap tree that was in the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, and if I could have bought that for £500,000 and protected it, I would have done.
Well, no, that's quite a serious answer, isn't
That's
it?
very clever,
Very
yeah.
worthy
That's my
one.
answer,
Yeah, no,
I
very good.
It's much cleverer
You
than
should have said
ours.
that as
I
a
should have
green.
said that. I know, not Arnie, sorry.
I couldn't think of anything else.
That's very good.
I think I would buy the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones, and then I'd take it to parties and slowly open it and see how people react.
I'd buy the car from Back to the Future, I think. Think of those fumes that it belches out, Jenny.
Oh, excellent.
Wouldn't
Give you
qualify for
palpitations. No, it really wouldn't. Now, on tomorrow's panel, the lawyer and political activist Dr Sholemos Shogbamimu, the Liberal Democrats Treasury spokesperson Sarah Olney, the Conservative peer and former leader in the Laws, Baroness Tina Stowell, and the director of the centre-right think tank Reform, Charlotte Pickles. And thanks to all of our panel for coming in tonight. Really enjoyed hearing what you've had to say. Now, in the next hour, I want to know what the phrase working class means to you. And what does it mean in 2024 compared to maybe 1924? Because I think there is a lot of elitism amongst the possibly upper middle classes in this country who think that they know what's good for the so-called working classes. We still have this paternalistic attitude in this country to so-called working class people. But what does working class even mean in 2024? Well, the creator of Peaky Blinders thinks he knows. But do you? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom